Folks, thank you very much for joining us for this panel. I don't know how many of you were here last year when we had a panel discussion about gun violence in American schools. It was a very powerful discussion because the events of the Parkland shooting were very, very close to us, and we had a couple of kids from that school as part of the discussion, and so as you can imagine, it became a very emotional and very powerful discussion. And today we're having what really amounts to a follow-up, and we do so in the knowledge that the trauma of Parkland has not gone away, and some of you may have already seen the news that last night one of the young women, one of the girls who survived the Parkland shooting took her own life, apparently because she was suffering from a sense of survivor guilt, with so many of her schoolmates having been shot dead. And that brings us to the topic of the discussion today. After Parkland and after almost every incident of gun violence in a school in the United States, so much of the discussion is about guns, whether they should be available, whether they're too easy to get. There's immediately a political battle between the pro-gun lobby and the anti-gun lobby. And lost in all of that, the fog of politics, is a discussion about the students and their physical and mental health. And I know that teachers find that incredibly frustrating. And fortunately, we have now among us 3 teachers who decided to do something about it and decided to start a national conversation in the United States about the mental health and the physical health of students, and hoping to lead to some important conclusions about how to prevent a Parkland from happening, how to spot difficult situations ahead of time, and then what to do about it. And I'm very proud to be sitting amongst them now, very proud to call them my friends. They're extraordinary educators, and one way to know how extraordinary they are is that all 3 of them have been finalists in the World Teacher Prize, which I think makes this the most stellar panel of this whole event. They are, thank you very much. They are from the far left, Brian Copes, Nadia Lopez, and Mike Vanderjagt. I'm going to start with you, Mike. I'm going to ask each of you to spend a couple of minutes just catching us up on what's happened with you and what's happened to what you're trying to do in the past year since we were last at this place.
Yeah, well, thank you all for being here. And it was, in the United States at least, it was on Valentine's Day that the Parkland shootings happened. The Day of Love is when that particular massacre happened. And the following day, myself and another a Global Teacher Prize finalist, Joe Fothery, who's in the United States, were on the phone and confused and angry, didn't know what to do, at a loss of what's happened over the last 20 years. Ever since the old days of Columbine, hundreds of our kids had died in school shootings. And it's interesting, I guess might be one word for it, but the Washington Post, one of our leading papers in the United States, they did a study not so long after Parkland, and they estimated of all the kids who are in the schools where these shootings have occurred, run the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And there's 223,000 students in over 200 schools that have had shootings over the last 20 years. Now, the National Association for PTSD, they estimate that over 1/4 of people who witness mass shootings actually will get that disorder and will have mental health issues. So that's over 60,000 students who likely have have PTSD or some similar type of disorder. Around the holidays, when people are buying presents, when all the new toys come out, there's been many cases where if one or two kids are injured by a toy, there's an outcry nationally to pull those toys off the shelf. We're talking over 220,000 students being affected by gun violence within the schools. That doesn't even include the vast majority of violence that happens outside the schools, in the neighborhoods. And we haven't done anything in the United States effectively or politically for 20 years while this has been happening. So, yeah, we decided to organize. We wanted our VTA organization to take the lead and once and for all let the teachers have the voice at the table and be the leaders in this. We're not necessarily interested in addressing the gun control issue. There's plenty of organizations and all the politics that go with that. We're thinking in terms of what's the root cause? What's making so many kids angry to the point where they want to act out violently? And is there something that, well, obviously we're missing something within the classroom, within our neighborhoods and communities to stop this from happening. And so that's been the big push and what we hope to address here tonight.
Nadia.
Good afternoon, I guess, everyone. My name is Nadia Lopez, and I'm a principal. I opened up a school in Brownsville, Brooklyn, which for many, if you Google Brownsville, Brooklyn, you'll hear about the violence, you'll hear about the poverty, and ironically for me, this is, as I'm sitting here listening to you, I'm getting emotional because last year when we sat on this panel, the young people from Parkland were on the panel with us. And I was actually dealing with a crisis in my school. I had a scholar, so I call my students scholars, who had been battling with mental health issues. He had been dealing with a home situation that exacerbated some behaviors that became threatening. He had engaged in self-inflicting behaviors from October. He was removed from school. He was placed in a hospital for some time. He came back. He felt like he couldn't acclimate himself to the school environment. So he was removed again. He went to an alternative school for some time. And then he returned back again. And at that time, his caregiver, not being clear and transparent about what was happening with the child, told us was more demanding and it became an insinuating situation in which they wanted to hold the school accountable but weren't being really a partner in the process of supporting the child. And you could see the child was in a place of distress. Ultimately, the child was removed from the caregiver's home and then subsequently removed from the school because they started to exhibit behaviors of writing on themselves, saying that they weren't going to live past the age of 16, and at the time he was only 13, and literally verbalizing this to the children in the school. So what I didn't mention was in October when he had engaged in this self-inflicting behavior, he had done it on our school property. And some of my scholars saw it. So that created a traumatic situation in which parents wanted to know, how is this happening in the school? What were we doing? So while I'm here in Dubai, this child who hadn't been in school for almost 6 weeks returns. And my team doesn't know what to do. Because at this point, we don't have a caregiver. There's an agency in place. No one is communicating. What do we do if something happens again? And so I was literally up every day until 4 o'clock, the time here, and having to be here by 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. And feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, because no one was listening to my team who said, we don't have the capacity of supporting this child, and we are afraid of what he's going to do. So it created the chain of command of sending out emails. I was part of the founding team for the National Coalition for Safe Schools. And I had to back out for a little bit because I also was dealing with the trauma of trying to manage everyone in the school, making sure everyone was safe. And the reality is that when I got back to New York to try to manage everything that we were going through, I found myself yelling and screaming with a lot of people not listening, with a lot of people telling me, if they want to kill themselves, they would have done it already. But not recognizing that this child literally had begun to cut himself and had 50 cut wounds around his arm. He had been in hospitals and released within hours. And it wasn't until he literally created a manifesto of that sinister look of what he was going to do and how he was going to do it. It was pages and pages and pages that someone said, oh, I think there's a problem here. And all I could say is, so when I was telling you there was something wrong, why didn't you listen? I had to tell my daughter and my mom. It was Good Friday. I remember that, telling them that I don't know if I was going to make it home the following week when we returned back from vacation. And that I wanted them to remember that if anything should happen, that I did my very best to save lives. Because I was willing to protect everyone in my building at the expense of my own life. It was the hardest thing to do, to tell a then 16-year-old and a 74-year-old that I may not make it home because there was a danger in my building. But luckily, the hospital worked in partnership with myself in understanding that this child really needed help. It was like finally someone listened. And he was removed and placed in an institution because that's how much help he needed. So my role has been in support of the organization, giving voice and context, because oftentimes when people think about urban schools, we think about the shootings that happen outside of the school. That does happen in my building, but there's this stigma or this stereotype that children of color who are impoverished don't commit acts of violence as well. And when we're saying we need help, people often think that we're exaggerating and not actually wanting to be part of the solution.
I'm Brian Copes, and really I don't feel to be an expert on the subject. You know, it's one of those things that, you know, as a teacher, I could sit back and say, I'm not an expert, you know, and ignore it, and let somebody else deal with it. But it's one of those things, you know, if not me, then who? You know, will you do it? And so often in our society, we expect somebody else to do it, and we're unwilling to step up because we're not the expert. And, you know, with this topic there in the United States, if we look at the second semester, the spring semester of last year, in the U.S., we averaged one school shooting per week. And that is a tragedy. You know, it's happening all around the country. It doesn't matter if it's inner city or if it's a wealthy suburb or out in the countryside. They're happening everywhere. So it's got to the point where, you know, it'd be shame on me if I sat back and didn't take a seat at the table and say, you know, is there a solution? Let's start talks. You know, we're not going to solve the problem overnight. We're not going to solve it with a weekend summit. But I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. And we had an organization called the National Life Group that came up, and we had conversation about this particular topic. And they were willing to help us as teachers join together to, first of all, organize what's called the National Coalition for Safe Schools. And they also helped us organize and begin our first national summit on school safety, which occurred 3 weeks ago, I believe it was.
Yes.
So, I think us as educators, we got to be willing to step out of our comfort zone and do things to make a difference, because if we don't, who will? Who knows best about the safety and well-being of your students than you? I mean, administrators are not in the classroom with us the whole time. They're not with the kids. They're in the office managing. Politicians aren't in our classroom. We're the ones in the classroom. We're the ones that know the heartbeat. We know the desires. We know the issues. We know our kids. And that's what I'm here to do, is to be a voice for my kids and see if we can find a solution on how we can prevent any kind of violence from happening, whether it's gun violence or any other type of physical violence.
I wanted to get a sense of the room here. Can I ask how many people here are teachers? Put your hand up, please. Okay. And how many of you are teachers from countries where the owning of a gun is legal? Where it's legal for a private citizen to own a gun? Where are you from? They're from the US. And you? Brazil. Okay. So one of the questions that's been on my mind, and we briefly discussed it last night, and I'd love to get some thoughts from the room as well when we open up to the floor, is what is it that makes gun violence possible, so prevalent in the United States? And the easy answer that always comes up is, well, it's because guns are available. Well, I'm sure that is a big part of the answer, but I'm struggling I can't bring myself to believe that that's the only reason. There are many countries in the world, as you said, you're from Brazil, there are many countries in the world where guns are not hard to get. Whether they're legal or not, they're not hard to get. There's gun violence taking place outside the classroom. There are criminal activities, the criminal gangs who use guns to commit violence. And yet, in those countries, kids are not going out getting guns, coming back to the school and shooting up their classmates. So I wonder whether there's something unique in the American system, whether there's something cultural. Is there something in the water that we're drinking that makes this a problem in the United States, but not so much in other parts of the world? And whoever wants to tackle this first, if you have a thought on this, I'd be curious to hear that.
Yeah, well, I know in the United States, there's at least as many guns as there are people. There's over 300 million guns on the streets. And, those are protected. What some other countries might not have in place is within our Constitution is that Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Now, it goes on to say for a well-regulated militia, but that tends to be ignored by a lot of people. So our entire history, from the frontier, the Wild West, it's been part of the culture in different parts of the country, certainly, that people carried guns. It was natural, and every so often they would use them against each other. I don't know how that transfers. Nobody does, and that's why that's the million-dollar question. By the way, my condolences to Brazil, who had I think 6 kids died in a shooting about a week and a half ago. Yeah, that's the great mystery. And then on top of it, we were talking last night, as you said, the violent movies, the video games, those are global.
Yeah, everyone watches them everywhere. Yeah.
Right, so that can't explain why it's so prevalent just in the United States and nowhere else. So yeah, no one has figured out that question. And
I'm gonna put you on the spot, if you don't mind. I'm gonna ask you. So this incident that took place a couple of weeks ago in Brazil, that was quite unusual for Brazil, for violence in school. Am I right to say that?
Actually, no.
It happens. Okay.
Yeah,
So
we have had a few incidents in school in Brazil for the last 20 years. Shootings, beatings. We even had a former employee who put the school on fire, basically.
While there
He
were
broke
students in it?
Yeah, he broke into a nursery school and set fire to
Student?
Yeah, small kids, like four.
No, no,
four,
the
five.
person setting the fire was a
Yeah,
student?
no, it's a former employee.
Employee, okay.
Yeah. So basically, in Brazil, schools have became places of violence.
But to what degree is that violence by students?
I think you could say like students are empowered by some sort of rage against probably the system or professors or a lack of perspective.
Right.
So whatever the teacher comes to students and whatever you say to a student that hurts him in any sense, he's gonna become violent towards you. So every single reason, every small reason is a perfect reason for an act of violence.
Yeah.
I mean, boyfriends, girlfriends, bullying, which I think is the main reason for violence in Brazil. But when a society is essentially a violent society like we have in Brazil or United States, you can say so, it is going to resemble in schools the way grown-ups act, buying guns and drug dealers and even police violence, which is a very serious issue in Brazil, so as in the United States. It is going to have an echo on students.
And is Brazil, is there a discussion like the one that they've been leading in the US? Is there a discussion among teachers, in the school systems about what to do about it? Is there a discussion to try and understand why the violence is taking place and how
Actually,
teachers should respond?
we are beyond that discussion. In fact, we have a new president, which is a far-right president.
Yeah.
And the spotlight had turned into whether we should buy more guns, we should arm teachers
Oh, so it's
to
very much
prevent
like
violence.
the US. Yeah.
So it's a different discussion. We are not trying to evolve to this point where we're not going to have violence in school. We need more guns to prevent violence, which is nonsense, actually.
Yeah.
So I think Brazilian society and all of the violent societies in the world are trying to emulate this United States model of buying guns, of carrying a gun to self-protect yourself. I don't know. We are definitely trying to emulate American society at this point. So get a gun to protect yourself.
Thank you. So I don't know if there's any comfort to be had from the fact that the US is not alone. In the discussions that you have started nationwide, are there some common threads that are being felt by schools in California as well as in Maine and in Oregon as well as in Florida about the how to make your classroom not safer from gun violence, but a safer place for children to talk about what is tormenting them, why they are so angry? Is there a conversation taking place amongst teachers about how to identify the students who are most likely, like the example that you gave, students who are closest to the edge and how to deal with those students?
So we spoke about this last year, that in most cases if you're in a school with a child who may exhibit some behaviors, it's always the common concern that's stated by teachers like, I don't know, this one looks like he'll go a little postal, or he seems a little angry. There are certain behaviors that children often exhibit. Not all the time, but there are things that you can tell in their behaviors, especially if they've been with you for a while, you get to know that child. I knew the scholar since 6th grade, so I was very aware that socially he was a little awkward. However, I also knew that he thrived in our school with his awkwardness because he found his place and his voice. But because of the caregiver, who often put constraints on his creativity, wanted him to follow a certain, if he wanted to, let's say, do robotics, They wanted them to do basketball. And it was like, you started to see him unravel, become upset, angry. I think for a lot of teachers, it's not so much the concern of how do we identify, but what do we do when we identify the child?
Right.
Having the capacity. So we focus so much on social emotional learning without the support that teachers need to deal with it.
Right.
Teachers need social emotional support. There's a lot of stress with working with the number of children in your school, having to do the pedagogy, having to do the curriculum, having to do the assessments, having to live your own life. There's so much that teachers are responsible for. The mental health component is not often there. That's one. Two, the time that we have doesn't often allot for teachers to build the relationships that children really need. So yes, they're with us a lot of time, but it's more focused on academics as opposed to let's help this child build character, let's engage them in a conversation, because oftentimes the child who's in crisis just needs someone to listen to them and be able to share, or at least know that there's a safe space for them to go.
So I want to again come back to the teachers in the audience. I'm sure all of you have experienced a situation where 1, 2, 5, any number of your students are displaying what you would consider alarming behavior that matches some of what Nadia is saying. I know when I went to school as a young boy, I had classmates who displayed this kind of behavior. Have any of you been in a situation where you felt that a student could become violent, that they were close enough to the edge that they would be violent? Never mind gun violence. If guns are not available, then no gun violence. But close enough that you felt like you should have a conversation with their parents, with the school authorities, or with the kid themselves. Anybody have you? Tell us a little bit about it. Tell us who you are and where you're from, and then.
Okay. My name is Lukman. I'm from Lagos, Nigeria. Yeah, I actually own a school, but the experience that I've had is about violence, about some of these behavioral issues, has to do more with most of the kids, unfortunately, who are Nigerians by birth or whatever, but they have been living outside the country. So, because they have started exhibiting some of those behavior over there, so the parents decide most of the time to return them back to Nigeria.
Right.
So I'm looking for what sometimes I do call rehabilitation homes, even though they are schools. So, and mine is one of such places that we have such children. It's always a very, very challenging situation for us most of the time to be able to get them, you know, to be able to socially behave with the kids that they are meeting on the ground. It takes a lot of effort in terms of counseling, in terms of serious discipline, in terms of consequence for, misbehaving, misbehavior sometimes and co like that. Sometimes we do not succeed in some. That maybe eventually the recommendation the school will have to make is for the parents to probably withdraw them. There are a good number of them that we have been able to succeed on, but it is not just an easy thing. But one of the important things that I see as being responsible for success has to do more with the environmental behavior that they meet. Because that is what is preponderance, that everybody is probably falling in line, everybody is behaving, and they find themselves as maybe lone ranger in the forest, so to speak. There are not so many of them, so they are easily cowed, so to speak. So, and that has really helped. Unlike when they are probably finding themselves in an environment where people like them are in abundance, they are in numbers that, okay, they can easily connect, they can easily discuss, they can, some of those things. African generally, when it comes to discipline, maybe to a large extent, that is one of the things that we are known for. Maybe it has its own downside, but then we have seen that it worked, so to speak, for us.
So this speaks to the point that you were saying, which is that that there is a culture of violence at large outside the schools, and that kind of seeps into the school system as well.
But there's also the issue of bullying, and Brian has spoken about that. Even as a child, the experiences of, sometimes we focus on the aggressor, the one who we see having the issues, but there's also the child who is being bullied and is silenced in that bullying. And so they start to plot and plan, right? And it's not that they want to hurt others, but feel like no one is listening to them. And as a result of it, they only see their form of dealing with it is violence. And we unfortunately come from a violent society. The United States was founded on violence, right? How we deal with things is we use weapons of mass destruction in some way, shape, or form in order to make a point. And so we don't know how to resolve things by just simply through communication. As much as we try to teach empathy, tolerance, understanding, compassion, as a society, we don't live that out. And I think that social media plays a role because we don't know what's happening in every single country. There could be issues that's happening throughout schools or throughout society, but we don't get to see it. What we do know is that children are often left to play these games that do incite some of the violence because parents feel like as long as they're in their bedroom and they're not outside and they're not doing anything wrong, but now you're giving them this game that is a fantasy, but it feels good. There's a release, there's an adrenaline that goes off that makes them feel powerful. And we don't address that because there's no conversation that happens inside of the school by those who create the policies, by those who feel like the best way to remedy this is to add more training for the teachers as opposed to adding more resources that can help alleviate some of the issues.
Brian, did you have a thought on this?
Well, we talk about how do we identify kids, and it's really an impossibility because, we can say, okay, do they exhibit signs? And, so often, I know growing up, I was one of those kids that was bullied. In the third grade, moved to a new school system, and I was the fat kid, and I was picked on. I wasn't the athletic kid. And the same kids I went to school with in third grade, I went to school with in fourth grade, I went to school with in 12th grade. There was no escape, these kids. And I think we can all answer the question, have you ever been just picked on or badgered, or you ever got to the point where you just snapped? And I think we all have. And I think a lot of times that's happening. I know I experienced that when I was in school, where I would just have enough and I would snap. All right, and we're finding some of this stuff happening in our schools. It's a good.
But Brian, if you don't mind me interrupting, what did you do when you snapped?
Well, mine it would probably be more in the fist fights and that type of stuff. But I'm in a situation where I'm the non-athletic fat kid, and I've got these athletes picking on me. If I get in a fight with them, what's going to happen? I have no way of winning. So what can I do to level the playing field? And we've got students doing that in the United States, where they would take a table knife, and they would hide just around the corner on the other side of the lockers. And when that person came up, they leveled the playing field by plunging that knife into their chest. We don't have a good answer. I know but we had Dr. Sherry Earle, which was one of the administrators at the Sandy Hook when that went down. And she probably gave the best advice I've heard. She says, we need to teach our kids to be kind. We need to teach our kids to be polite, because polite kids are not violent kids. And I think that's a lot of what we're missing, because if we're kind to each other, we're not going to have that moment of snapping. I don't need to level that playing field. And I don't know.
folks, I want to make this as, thank you. I want to make this as inclusive a conversation as possible. So please, if you have a question or if you have a comment, if you have a suggestion, this is meant to be a learning exercise. Please identify yourself, and then I'll try and come to you, and then please identify yourself for the group, and then.
My name is Ruben Abraham. I used to be a college professor in a past life. So I'm actually fascinated by the question Bobby raised about, is there something unique that's going on? So in literature around the psychology of suicide, there's this phenomenon known as copycat suicides, which is when you commit a suicide, then you make it okay to commit suicide, and then people, so you see these clusters of suicides emerging. So I'm just wondering if anyone's actually looked at the data pre and post Columbine. So is it that the reporting has gone up after Columbine, or have incidents gone up after Columbine? Right? I mean, do we actually know anything about the data on this in terms of the more of these shootings we have, the more likely we are to have more?
Yeah, we were very fortunate to bring in some of our country's experts in school psychology, child psychology, counseling, social work, law enforcement. And you know, one of the things that really still resonates in my mind, there's no real pattern for the kids who have done this, the mass shootings. Certainly some of them, after they murdered their peers, they also killed themselves, but not all of them. Some were bullied, some were not. You know, only a few have conclusively been deemed, you know, copycat suicides or copycat crimes. You know, the reasons for this, after they've, you know, studied what the students had done, yeah, there's no real pattern, there's no profile that they've been able to deduce pre or post Columbine. So I'm not sure if any of you have thoughts, but yeah, that really struck me that it would be helpful if there were, you know, if there were clear signs that here's the type of behavior you look for to prevent extreme violence from happening. But
we looked at the data on this post-Columbine? Is that data even available?
Yeah, it is.
So I'm a journalist, so I reported on this quite a bit. And there is a wide consensus among the general public that the number of school shootings is going up. According to data and statistics, that's actually not true. What has changed is the way that we talk about these things and social media. And if you look at what happened in Christchurch, that spreads everywhere and it spreads very, very fast. And the concern is, from every psychologist and sociologist and everyone who talks about this, is that the impact of social media is ultimately going to start changing things and having a much wider influence. And according to the experts, this is not coming from me, it's an especially growing concern considering the rise in populism that we've seen over the last couple of years.
So the incidence of violence has not gone up.
Correct. It's not gone up.
Is the fact that the numbers of victims has increased is one reason for that the kinds of weapons that are now available? That previously you'd only be able to bring a 6-shooter and would not be as effective as killing large numbers?
So the data that I'm talking about is really comparing the 90s to today. So I'm imagining that the types of weapons available really hasn't substantially changed.
Same, yeah.
But the reports that I have read haven't gotten really into that, so I really can't speak to it.
That's useful. Thanks. I'll take a question from you, and then we'll come around.
Hi, my name is Nandita, and I'm a creative consultant. My question is directed to you, Nadia, since you said you work with troubled children. If you know a child has problems like, you know, maybe self-harming or aggression, and if you bring it up with the parents and they turn a blind eye to it and just, you know, say you're exaggerating, how do you help the child?
So it's not the parent whoever says that. Yeah, but it's never the parent. So anytime we've had that, I've had that over the 9 years of having opened up my school. Because of the type of school community we've created, the parents are very open and receptive. We contact the parent, we have them come in, we literally create a letter that the parent must take to the hospital, accompanying the child to the hospital, because we won't let the child back into the building unless they've had medical clearance. The issue often is the quality of mental health support that that child will receive. If the child isn't, children only speak to people they trust. So they know how not to say whatever's going to get them in what they consider more trouble. One, the type of hospitals in areas of the highest needs are not going to have the type of professionals who can handle the capacity of what's needed. They're usually high turnover people, people who are burnt out, people who are not listening. And so I have had to develop a relationship with the local hospital, with the chief of staff for psychiatric support, the vice president of external affairs. Like, I literally go to their office and sit with parents because I'm like, I can't keep suspending this child because of their behaviors, or I can't keep saying this child has to keep coming to the hospital and someone isn't doing their job, right? Or this child has had 3 psychologists or 3 psychiatrists in a matter of 6 months. There's a problem, right? Because then what the child starts to do is engage in desperate behaviors. No one's listening to me, so they keep upping the ante. Where it comes from are the people who are in positions of policies or those who are higher up in the Department of Education. They're not face to face with the children. So they don't understand what it means to deal with a child who's at risk. I don't fear my kids, honestly. I have kids who are in gangs. I have kids whose parents are in jail. I don't fear them. But for that particular kid that I was dealing with last year, I feared him. Because this child looked at me with no sense of remorse or a soul because he had had it. No one was listening, and he was at this critical stage of, I've already hurt myself enough, now let's see what will happen if I hurt someone else.
That's interesting. So Brian, I wanted to find, as you all have conversations and with other teachers, are you also having conversations with students who went right up to the edge and then didn't go that one step farther, who came close but were saved by an intervention, or for one reason or the other didn't commit an act of mass murder? Are you having those conversations? Are they telling you things that are informing your thought process, your decision making on how to deal with other kids?
I know a lot of the students that I get, in particularly in my class, a lot of times they're not real successful in the traditional classroom. I teach a shop class, which is more hands-on, which seems to be an outlet for kids. And I have kids that will gravitate towards me, and that they will come out of their shell, and they feel safe and protected in that environment. But I've never really had them come up to me and said, hey, I was at my wit's end. But you know, when I see a kid that's struggling with another student or with a bullying situation, you know, I will step in, and that's where, you know, I will put my arm around that kid, and I will do everything in my power to make that kid feel safe and welcome, because a lot of times they don't feel welcome.
You had a thought.
My name is Hallie Campbell, and I work for an organization that partners with 14 different universities in the U.S. to provide high school students with pre-college opportunities for the summer. So students from around the world elevated to a college campus level, so that kind of brings the pressures to another level for both students and families. So we're kind of finding, you know, we only get these students from anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. So we're finding families neglecting to disclose information about their mental health because they think it's giving them that competitive advantage as far as school goes, and thinks there's going to be kind of discrimination as far as that goes from us educators. So I'm wondering, Nadia, specifically to you, because you've dealt with this and difficulties with families and kind of communicating, how you think we as educators can tell families, you know, that is not a disadvantage for your student to have these, you know, mental health issues. If anything, you know, we want to be there and be proactive rather than reactive in this situation.
It's hard, right? So from the time my parents are actually coming into my school, so for you with the program, it's messaged. I tell my parents and I tell my scholars, mental health support is great. Therapy is good, right? Like I try to make it that it's not something that, because in our community it's taboo to do it, right? I tell them all the time, I have a teenager and I've had to take her to get mental health support just because there are pressures that children today are dealing with that I didn't have to necessarily deal with. And it is okay. But there are some parents who don't look at it as a help for their child. They look at it as something is wrong with me. And that's when the problem comes in, because they're not looking at it as we're here to work together so your child is successful. They look at it as I did something wrong and my child is not, it's broken. And it's like, that's not the case. And because you have such a short turnaround, you don't get to have that impact. With us, it's about developing trust. And then finally, I'll have a parent sit down and tell me all of the things about a child. Like I used to have a child who would literally, 1 minute would be fine, and then the next minute was like, what just happened? To a point that teachers were like, I don't even know if I should say anything, because I feel like if I say something, they may say I did something, right? So I had to literally leave my school, go to the parents' work site and say, I need you to come back, because for me to leave my building to come get you from work means that there's a problem. The mom finally disclosed that she was dealing with, she was bipolar. Her mother was schizophrenic. Her sister was manic depressive. So I was like, so your daughter may have the gene? And she was like, she actually is bipolar. And I was like, so you would need to let us know that so we know when she's not good, how to handle her and have a different type of conversation about what to do. But it takes time and trust.
Hi, I'm Lisa Grace. I'm an education journalist and also an educator. And we are talking a lot about gun violence, but in the UK there's like an increase in knife crime as well. And so it seems the young people are using whatever they can get their hands on to inflict harm. So I wanted to find out what can schools do to empower themselves and to empower the students to really, combat this increased, I think it's an increase in violence that's taking place.
Is there, any thoughts?
Yeah, one thing that came out in the summit is what the school psychologists call the 2020 effect.
Yeah.
You figure on average about 20% of teens are going to exhibit some kind of depression or anxiety while they're teens. And then only 20% of them will get the necessary help and treatment that they need and the supports that they need. So in a country the size of the United States with tens of millions of teens, that's an astronomical number of kids out there who have some kind of mental health issue and who don't have any kind of treatment or the proper supports. Many schools, the poorer schools or rural schools, they don't have necessarily a full staff of counselors and or school psychologists and or social workers on staff. We had teachers from all around the country at our summit, and one thing that really struck out is that I don't think any school that was represented there followed the national guidelines of the student counselor ratio. They suggest that it should be 250 students per counselor. We had one school, the counselor there was one counselor for the whole school, and I think it was something like nearly 1,000 students for one counselor. How can you provide the supports that kids are going to need? The other thing that struck me is, and still stands out in my mind, in the United States at least, more than half of the counties nationwide don't have a single facility for mental health. There's not a single psychiatrist in that county. So it's a systemic problem within schools. It's a systemic problem within our society as a whole. People are not getting the supports that they need. And that's what we're really going to try to push.
But just to
And the-
that point, right? 250 children to one counselor. You would not have 250 patients to a mental health provider. You know, like, and we have a shorter amount of time with the children. So between individualized education plans of mandated counseling plus the children who may need support, this counselor doesn't even have the capacity of supporting the children. And parents are not taking their kids to get the mental health support that they need, again, because of the stigma, because they don't want to be labeled crazy.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm from China. We don't have gun problems in schools, but we do have other problems. So in our schools, like we all have safeguards to protect the school, like 4 safeguards with weapon, like electricity stick something. So I'm wondering if it's possible for American school that to have some safeguards to protect the
Do you mean
school.
like X-ray machines, that kind of thing?
Yeah,
Or physical checks?
Yeah, and we have gate. We also try to protect our students. You know, some violence also happened in China because just last month, not a teacher, a worker used a hammer to hurt many kids, like 20 kids. So we do have safeguards. So I'm wondering if it's possible. Or security gate, you know, like the airport, and we can check if someone has gun.
So like an X-ray machine?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I know some number of inner city schools in particular have metal detectors at their doors. Most schools do not. At some point, and this is, with newer technologies, this is a growing concern. It was, I think, about a half year ago, the blueprints, the plans of how to 3D print plastic guns was put online. And tens of thousands of downloads happened with that. And so, yeah, you can actually, with a 3D printer, you can make a plastic gun, and that will make, at some point, that will make metal detectors obsolete going into the future. So, in my school, I'm in a big suburban school. We don't have metal detectors, even though we do have, gang violence in the neighborhoods. One of the reasons is we have so many first floor windows. It would be very easy to get around metal detectors at the door if kids hid guns by the windows overnight or something, and they could just pull them out, the next morning. So there's all sorts of ways around metal detectors. One of the nightmare scenarios that law enforcement brings up in the United States, there's most schools have large numbers of kids who are bussed in. How do you protect, where parents out in the parking lots, right, where everyone is? How can you prevent somebody from coming by and doing drive-by shootings when you have hundreds of kids coming off or going on buses? What if you have a fully loaded bus in our buses, you can have up to 60 kids on a bus, smaller kids. What if somebody decided they wanted to walk on the bus and there's nowhere to go? There's no exit for them. So I never thought in my teaching career we'd have to be thinking about this and taking action on it. But those are real possibilities in this day and age that we have to consider.
Are they having similar conversations in Brazil?
Yeah, that was my question.
Closer.
That was my question, actually. I'd like to put a simple, quick question for all of you. You included, Bobby. Do you think that concrete measures are effective towards violence control in schools?
Do we think what measures?
Concrete measures such as X-rays and metal detectors and
Well,
armored
I think
windows.
that's what Mark just said. I mean, you can have metal detectors, but a school is a very large campus.
Armed professors, armed teachers.
Yeah.
Do you think that it is effective?
Arming teachers.
Yeah, that's a discussion we are having in Brazil right now.
Would any of you carry arms if
Absolutely not.
In Birmingham, we just had a shooting not long ago. It happened in a school that had a metal detector. You know, when we install metal detectors, oftentimes most schools will have what we call a security resource officer.
There was another school where there was a policeman on campus and he got shot. He was armed.
May have been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, a lot of times we have the school resource officer on campus. I mean, you know, what kind of learning environment if we're turning our schools into something more of a prison? So, you know, how tight do we do our security? Just something to think about.
So, sorry, go ahead, Don.
Quickly, in New York, so as I think about school violence, there's just so many levels of school violence, right? So there is the school violence that may have to deal with children arming themselves to protect themselves from what's happening on the outside. So I've had children who have armed themselves because to leave my school building, we have over 40 gangs in our neighborhood. My boys, to get to school, that safe harbor that they get from one project building, which is the housing developments, to get to our school during certain times is gang initiation. So when they get to us, they're safe. By the end of the day, it's about survival. So they may be armed with something. They're not going to necessarily tell us unless someone says something or they say, I just need to let you know. And at that point, we do contact the parents and we have to go through this whole process. But there's a real life threat for many of my children just to get to school. I had a child who was badly beaten, that his orbital socket was crushed, and it took nearly 6 months for him to recuperate. And that trauma, instead of him having a safety transfer out, he still had to come in the same direction, right? In comparison, there's the school violence that's associated with the child who is going through a crisis and uses this as a way of getting the attention that no one is paying attention to them, right? So having a metal detector doesn't attack what's at the root of it. Why are we having the violence in the first place? So if it's about the neighborhood and the conditions of the neighborhood, then we need to discuss what are the things that we need to put in place in the community so that we can lessen the crime, lessen the need for children to be so violent. If it's about our children wanting to hurt each other because they're being bullied or because they're having mental health issues, what are the resources that we need to put in place in our schools to make sure that children feel like there's someone they can talk to? And that's not happening, right? Because all you hear in the news is, let's take guns off the street, and then it becomes the NRA versus everyone else. And it's like that, we need to have a conversation about why is this happening?
Yeah. So I see lots of hands are up now, but we only have time left for one question. The cool thing about this conference is that they'll be here today and tomorrow, so you can grab them at any time and have a conversation. You get the last one.
Hi, thank you. My name's Martin. I'm also an education journalist from the UK, and again, knife crime has become such a big issue for us. In the national debate, knife crime has become such a big issue for us over the past few weeks. Given the experience you've had of violence in schools, albeit guns more than knives, do you have any advice or thoughts for schools and teachers in the UK who are being confronted with perhaps knife crime for the first time or are concerned? Anything you think they could do now to counter it or prevent it or keep their pupils safe?
You know, when it happens, you know, it happens like that. It happens in a split second. It's something really violent were to happen like that. But as far as prevention, you know, the single easiest thing to do, the first step, is to get to know the kids. You know, it's fairly easy for me after the first couple of weeks, reading facial expressions. A number of times I've been able to, you know, after class, just pull a kid aside. You know, how you doing today? I noticed something just a little bit different. You know, for newer teachers, that's you kind of gain that sense with experience. I've got over 20 years in the classroom. But again, every kid is different. Everyone has different circumstances. If there's no trusting relationship, and if you don't talk with the kids, and then more importantly, listen to their responses, so many of them are desperate just to be heard. Often that's all it takes. And there's just that relief. And then if you do that one time, they're more likely to come to you with their next issue and let you know. And just to have that outlet, just to not keep building that up. And then I know Nadia has some thoughts on this.
And then I'll let Brian go. So what I would say as an administrator, everything happens at leadership. It starts with, this is the time that it should start at the top. Because the teachers need to feel safe. So in the crisis that I dealt with, I had to galvanize everyone to come to the school building. So the first thing is addressing the issue and being clear and transparent. We have a problem here. So letting teachers be able to verbalize what they're getting, what they're feeling, and what are the sense that they feel within the community as well as in the classroom. Coming up with a plan of action. So I partnered with the New York City Department of Education, people who were in the safety within the Department of Education, my local precinct, my council member, because if there's an issue, let's say in the neighborhood in regards to knives, it's a community issue. So who are the politicians who need to also address it? Because it's not just happening in one school, it's happening in multiple schools. And then coming up with an action plan. And having teacher leaders, those who should be at the table to have a voice, so that everyone is clear on what are we going to do next, and then from there bringing in the parents, having a special assembly with the children, or having, I usually like cut out like periods out of the day where we're gonna address this. Because at the end of the day, when the problem is that we often wanna stay silent about it and act like it's one isolated situation. And unless we're clear and transparent of saying this is happening, then we won't affect any change. Sorry, go ahead.
Brian, the last word?
Yeah, I think the best preventative measure is to have kind, loving, caring, and engaged teachers in the classroom. So often teachers are overworked, underpaid, and really just don't want to be there. We've all seen that teacher. And when we have that, they're not kind, they're not loving, they're not engaged with their students. And I think there's where a lot of our problem comes in. So the kids don't have that.
Well,
that
you've just
safety.
described all three of you very, very well. Brian, Nadia, Mark, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.